Imagine a family that seemed perfect from the outside. A successful businessman father, a kind and charitable mother, and their only son, the heir to everything they had built. But behind closed doors, arguments were brewing, resentments were growing, and greed was slowly poisoning the home. The rain had just begun to fall when the town of Greyford prepared for another quiet evening. The streets were dimly lit by flickering lamps and the sound of thunder rolled far away in the sky. In the heart of this quiet town stood the Armand estate, a mansion that symbolized both wealth and respect. People often pointed to the house with admiration, whispering about the fortune and generosity of Richard and Eleanor Armand. They were not only wealthy but respected, admired, and trusted by everyone around them. Richard Armand was a man of business, sharp in his decisions, feared by rivals, and admired by friends. He had built an empire from nothing, turning small investments into towering real estate holdings. He believed in order and discipline, and he believed even more in the value of hard work. Those who knew him said his eyes could pierce through lies, and his presence demanded respect. His wife, Eleanor, was the opposite in nature but equal in strength. Gentle, compassionate, and charitable, she was known for her kindness. She supported local schools, helped orphaned children, and gave large donations to hospitals. People often said that if Richard was the head of the family, Eleanor was its heart. Together they seemed unstoppable, the perfect couple with a perfect reputation. But every perfect story has its cracks. And in the Armand family, the crack came in the form of their only son, Damien. Damien grew up in luxury. His toys were imported from other countries, his clothes tailored, his education paid for at the finest institutions. Yet he lacked the hunger for hard work that defined his father. Where Richard saw value in discipline, Damien saw only restrictions. Where Eleanor tried to guide him with love, he responded with arrogance. He wanted more than what was given, and what was given was already far more than most could dream of. From his teenage years, Damien showed little interest in the family business. While his father tried to teach him contracts and negotiations, Damien skipped meetings to spend time in nightclubs. While Richard discussed investments, Damien dreamed of fast cars and lavish parties. His friends described him as charming but reckless, a young man who lived in the moment with no care for tomorrow. As he grew older, tension inside the Armand household grew sharper. Arguments erupted behind the closed doors of the mansion. Servants often heard raised voices late into the night. Richard accused his son of being irresponsible, demanding that he change his ways or risk losing everything. Damien in turn accused his father of being controlling, claiming that the wealth belonged to him as much as to his parents. Eleanor tried to be the peacemaker, often giving Damien money in secret to calm his anger, but her kindness only deepened his sense of entitlement. By the time Damien reached his mid-20s, the relationship between father and son had become poisonous. Richard had begun considering changes to his will. He confided to a friend that if Damien did not change, he would cut him off completely and donate most of his fortune to charity. That threat, once whispered, would later be remembered with a chilling clarity. Neighbors spoke of strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Security cameras around the estate were found disconnected without explanation. Damien was seen wandering the grounds late at night, pacing alone, his face dark with thought. A maid claimed she heard him muttering in his room, repeating words she could not understand except for one chilling phrase, "One day it will all be mine." Then came the night that changed everything. The storm on that evening was violent. Rain pounded against the windows of Greyford, lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the walls. Inside the mansion, lights flickered as the storm worsened. Some neighbors swore later that they heard a scream carried faintly through the rain, though at the time they dismissed it as nothing more than the weather. The following morning, silence hung over the estate. The maid arrived at her usual hour, expecting to find Eleanor in the kitchen with her warm smile. Instead she found darkness. The rooms were still, the air heavy with something unspoken. She called out, but no answer came. Then, as she entered the living room, she froze. Richard Armand lay on the floor, his body covered in wounds, his face pale and lifeless. Blood stained the carpet beneath him. Nearby, Eleanor was slumped against the sofa, her hands marked with cuts that spoke of a desperate struggle. Her eyes were open, but they no longer saw. The maid screamed, her cries carrying through the mansion until neighbors rushed in. Within minutes the police arrived, their flashing lights reflecting off the wet pavement outside. What they discovered inside the house left them shaken. It was not the work of a burglar. Nothing had been stolen. Expensive jewelry still sat in its case, cash remained untouched, and valuable art pieces hung undisturbed on the walls. Whoever had committed this crime had come not for possessions but for blood. The police began their investigation immediately, combing through the mansion for clues. The first question they asked was simple. Where was Damien? Damien returned to the house later that day, driving up in his luxury car, the storm now past and the air heavy with suspicion. Officers questioned him at once. He claimed he had been away, visiting a friend in another city. But when investigators contacted that friend, the story quickly unraveled. The friend admitted Damien had begged him to cover for him. There was no evidence that Damien had been anywhere else that night. More disturbing still was his behavior. Witnesses later testified that Damien did not collapse in grief upon hearing the news. He did not demand answers or cry for his mother. Instead, his first questions to the officers were about what would happen to the estate, about who would control the fortune now that his parents were gone. For the investigators, suspicion had found its target. Damien had motive, he had opportunity, and his alibi was false. But proving his guilt would be far harder than suspecting it. The murders of Richard and Eleanor Armand were only the beginning of a mystery that would stretch for years. And as investigators began their work, Damien was already preparing his next move. Because before the police could gather enough to arrest him, he disappeared. And when he resurfaced years later, he was no longer the troubled son of a wealthy family. He was one of the richest men in the country, untouchable, and cloaked in power. The unanswered question haunted everyone who remembered that stormy night. Did Damien Armand truly kill his parents for wealth, or had someone else struck them down while suspicion conveniently fell upon him? The truth, to this day, remains hidden in the shadows. The disappearance of Damien Armand was as sudden as it was suspicious. One day he was standing inside the mansion, questioned by police officers, and the next he was gone. His absence only deepened the mystery that was already gripping Greyford. People whispered in markets, on the streets, and in hushed voices at church. Some believed he had fled because he was guilty. Others argued that the real killer must have been someone else, and Damien had simply run out of fear that he would be framed. The police tried to track him, but it was as if Damien had vanished into thin air. There were no credit card records, no flight tickets under his name, no clear trail of where he might have gone. What puzzled investigators further was that he had left behind not only the mansion but also his personal belongings, clothes, and even his car. It looked less like a planned escape and more like someone had simply walked out of one life and into another. Meanwhile, the investigation into the murders pressed on. Detectives went through every room in the Armand estate. They studied the broken glass on the floor, the overturned furniture, and the trail of blood that told a story of violent struggle. Richard had fought fiercely before falling. Eleanor had tried to defend herself, her wounds showing the desperate attempt of a mother clinging to life. Yet there was no forced entry into the house. No locks had been broken. Whoever entered that mansion on the night of the storm had been let in. This fact troubled the investigators. If Damien was away, then who did his parents trust enough to open the door for in the middle of the night? If Damien was home, then why did his alibi collapse under questioning? The contradictions fed the growing storm of suspicion. The police called in everyone who had worked in the house. The maid who found the bodies told her story over and over, trembling each time she recalled the scene. The gardener spoke of seeing Damien arguing with his father just days before the murders. The chauffeur admitted that Damien had asked him strange questions about the security system, as if testing how easily it could be bypassed. Each testimony added weight to the growing case against the missing son. But a case built on suspicion is not enough. Investigators needed hard evidence. They searched for the murder weapon but found nothing. They dusted the house for fingerprints, yet most belonged to the family or the servants. A few smudged prints were discovered, but none were clear enough to identify. The storm had washed away potential evidence outside the mansion, leaving detectives frustrated and empty-handed. Days turned into weeks. The funerals of Richard and Eleanor took place under heavy clouds of grief. Hundreds attended, bringing flowers and tears. But Damien was not among them. His absence was more noticeable than any presence could have been. Standing at the graveside, relatives whispered their anger. How could a son not come to say goodbye? Some believed he stayed away because guilt would not allow him to face the eyes of the community. Others thought he was already planning his new life far from Greyford. The media soon caught hold of the story. Headlines screamed across newspapers, "Wealthy couple murdered in their mansion. Son missing after brutal slaying." Talk shows invited so-called experts to discuss whether Damien was a cold-blooded killer or a victim of tragic circumstances. The case had all the elements that fascinated the public: wealth, betrayal, murder, and mystery. One journalist dug into Damien's past, uncovering stories of his gambling debts and reckless spending. Another revealed that Richard had recently spoken to his lawyer about changing his will. If Richard had lived just a few weeks longer, Damien might have been cut out entirely from the inheritance. That revelation fueled speculation that Damien had killed his parents before he could lose everything. The police, pressured by both the public and the media, intensified their search. They sent out notices, contacted airports, and questioned anyone who might have helped Damien escape. Yet each lead dissolved into nothing. Every road ended in silence. Months passed, and the case grew cold. Without Damien, there could be no trial. Without evidence, there could be no conviction. The mansion was eventually sealed, its windows dark, its once vibrant halls filled only with echoes. The community moved on, but the shadow of that stormy night never lifted. Then, years later, whispers began to surface. A man was seen in another city, living under a different name, driving expensive cars, and surrounded by bodyguards. Photographs surfaced of a figure who looked strikingly like Damien. His hair was styled differently, his clothes more refined, his presence commanding. He was no longer the troubled heir of Greyford but a rising businessman in an entirely new world. This revelation reignited the fire of suspicion. How had he acquired such wealth so quickly? What connections allowed him to rise from a fugitive to a man of influence? Reporters tried to follow him, but his circle was tightly guarded. Any attempts to question him were met with silence. Those who approached him claimed he smiled but never answered, as if daring the world to accuse him without proof. Back in Greyford, investigators reopened the case. They revisited old files, re-examined photographs, and tried to piece together the puzzle. But too much time had passed. Witnesses had moved away, memories had faded, and the trail had grown colder than ever. One detail, however, continued to haunt the lead detective. The night watchman of the Armand estate, an elderly man named Howard, had once told them he saw Damien entering the house shortly before the storm worsened. His statement had been crucial. But before he could testify formally, Howard died suddenly in what was ruled a heart attack. Without his testimony, the timeline remained uncertain. Some investigators suspected foul play, but nothing was proven. The lack of answers drove the case into the realm of legend. Greyford residents told the story to newcomers, warning them of how greed could turn a son against his own parents. The Armand mansion, left abandoned, became a symbol of tragedy, its empty halls holding the memory of screams lost in the storm. And yet, somewhere beyond the quiet town, Damien continued to grow his empire. He was spotted at lavish parties, whispered about in financial circles, and rumored to control hidden fortunes. To the public, he was a success story. To those who remembered, he was the missing son who had left 2 bodies behind. The mystery deepened, and the line between truth and rumor blurred further with each passing year. Was Damien truly guilty, or had someone else taken advantage of his troubled reputation to commit the perfect crime? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the story of betrayal and blood refused to fade. The new city where Damien Armand was rumored to be living was nothing like Greyford. It was vast, crowded, and pulsing with ambition. Here fortunes were made quickly and lost just as fast. The skyline was filled with towers of glass and steel, symbols of wealth and power. In this place a man could reinvent himself completely, and Damien had done just that. Under a different name he began appearing in elite social circles. At first he was the quiet man standing at the edge of gatherings, observing and listening. But slowly he moved closer to the center. He invested in businesses, took risks that paid off, and aligned himself with powerful partners. Within a few years he was no longer just another face in the crowd. He was a man people wanted to know, a man whose opinion carried weight. The transformation was startling. Gone was the young heir with messy debts and reckless behavior. In his place stood a calculated businessman with sharp suits, polished shoes, and an aura of control. He spoke little of his past, and when asked about his family he would simply smile and change the subject. No one pressed him further. In the world of wealth and power, secrets were common and often respected. But not everyone forgot. Reporters from Greyford continued to chase him. One particularly determined journalist named Laura Greaves spent years gathering fragments of information. She followed money trails, compared photographs, and interviewed anyone who might have crossed paths with Damien. Laura believed with every fiber of her being that Damien had killed his parents and escaped justice. Her articles reignited public debate. Old wounds in Greyford reopened. Families of Richard and Eleanor demanded that authorities act. But law enforcement was limited. Damien had carefully erased his traces, and in the new city he was known by another identity, one supported by documents that appeared flawless. Without concrete proof no legal action could be taken. Meanwhile Damien's empire grew. He owned restaurants, invested in real estate, and even funded political campaigns. His name, or rather the name he had chosen for his new life, was spoken with respect. Those who did business with him admired his vision. Those who envied him whispered dark rumors but never dared say them aloud in his presence. At night, however, when he was alone in his penthouse apartment, Damien sometimes stared out at the city lights with a look that betrayed unease. He drank slowly, his eyes distant, as though the ghosts of Greyford lingered just beyond the glass. Did he feel guilt or only fear of discovery? Nobody knew. Laura Greaves eventually managed to track down a man who had once worked for Damien as a driver. He revealed strange details. Damien insisted on taking long routes home, always checking if cars followed. He would disappear into abandoned warehouses late at night and emerge hours later with a calm face. The driver also claimed Damien carried an old locket that belonged to his mother, clenching it tightly when he thought no one was watching. This discovery added a chilling layer to the story. If Damien truly had killed his parents, why would he carry a piece of his mother with him? If he was innocent, then was the locket a reminder of love or of guilt? No one could say. As Laura published her findings, the new city began to take notice. Some investors pulled away, fearing scandal. Others grew more intrigued, convinced that Damien's mysterious past only added to his aura of power. Damien himself responded with silence. He did not sue the newspapers. He did not give interviews. He simply continued building his fortune as though no storm could touch him. Back in Greyford, the police reopened the investigation officially. New technology allowed them to re-examine old evidence. DNA testing had advanced. Fingerprints could be analyzed more precisely. They discovered traces of an unknown individual in the Armand mansion, someone who was neither Richard, Eleanor, nor Damien. This raised an alarming possibility. Had investigators been wrong all along? Had Damien been guilty of fleeing but not of murder? The theory shook the case. Some detectives argued that Damien had hired someone to do the killing. Others suggested a stranger might have broken in after all. The uncertainty kept the case alive in headlines once again. For Greyford residents, the wound reopened with renewed force. Meanwhile, Damien's wealth placed him among the elite. He attended charity galas, posed for photographs with leaders, and smiled for cameras. Yet beneath the polished surface there was tension. He changed security teams frequently, never trusting one set of guards for long. He lived in constant motion, flying from one city to another, never staying in one place too long. Those who worked close to him noticed he rarely slept through the night. Sometimes they heard him pacing at 3 a.m, his footsteps restless. Sometimes they found broken glasses in the sink, as if thrown in anger. No matter how far he rose, he could not outrun the shadows that followed him. Laura Greaves prepared her boldest move. She planned to travel to the new city, confront Damien in person, and record his reaction. It was a dangerous plan, but she believed the truth demanded it. When she finally stood outside one of his luxury events, she felt her hands trembling. The man she had hunted for years was only a few steps away. As Damien exited the building surrounded by guards, Laura called his name loudly, not the new identity but the old one. Damien Armand. The crowd turned. The bodyguards tensed. And for a brief second Damien froze. His eyes locked onto Laura's. In that moment there was recognition, fear, and something else too, perhaps rage. Then he smiled faintly, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked into his waiting car without a word. The silence was louder than any denial could have been. The video of that moment spread quickly online. Millions debated what the look in Damien's eyes had meant. Was it the look of a guilty man exposed or of an innocent man tired of being haunted? The arguments raged, but the truth remained buried under layers of mystery. And so the story of Damien Armand grew even larger. No longer confined to Greyford, it became an international obsession. Books were written, documentaries produced, and podcasts dissected every detail. But still the central question remained unanswered. Did he kill his parents to inherit their wealth, or was he an unfortunate son forever condemned by suspicion? The mansion in Greyford still stood, empty and silent, while Damien's empire cast a long shadow across a distant city. Two worlds tied together by blood, betrayal, and secrets, waiting for the day when truth would finally break through. Greyford remained a town caught between memory and suspicion. The Armand mansion stood abandoned, its windows dark, its gardens overgrown. Local children dared each other to enter, but the adults avoided it, speaking only in whispers about what had happened that stormy night years ago. Meanwhile, Damien Armand, living under his new identity, continued to build his empire far from the town that had branded him a murderer. Years of careful planning had given him a life of wealth, power, and influence. He invested in businesses, acquired properties across continents, and became a figure in international finance. No one questioned the source of his fortune too closely, and he made sure it remained that way. Private accountants, legal shells, and complex financial structures shielded him from scrutiny. Yet even as his wealth grew, the shadows of Greyford never left him. The truth about Damien's past began to surface slowly, as if the universe itself refused to let it be forgotten. One of the first signs came from an old acquaintance, a former business associate who had known Damien before he vanished. The man recounted how Damien had spoken openly about resentment toward his parents, expressing frustration at being controlled and belittled. While he never admitted to violence, the intensity of his words alarmed those around him. Meanwhile, Greyford's police continued their efforts. New forensic methods allowed investigators to re-examine old evidence. Traces of DNA from the Armand mansion that had previously been inconclusive were reprocessed. For the first time, small anomalies appeared, clues that had been invisible years before. However, they were not enough to identify a killer. Every lead seemed to dissolve, as if someone had deliberately cleaned the tracks of the crime. The media, too, played a role in keeping Damien's story alive. Investigative journalists pieced together the timeline of his escape. They tracked flights, cell phone records, and social media footprints. Articles speculated about how Damien had managed to disappear so completely. Was it planning, luck, or outside help that allowed him to vanish after the murders and resurface as a billionaire years later? Every new story reignited public fascination and fear. In Greyford, a small group of old friends and neighbors who had remembered Damien as a child began to share observations they had once dismissed. Some recalled his obsession with wealth and status, others noted his impatience and sudden outbursts of anger. All of these recollections, combined with the crime itself, painted a disturbing portrait of a man whose ambition may have known no bounds. But not all the revelations were straightforward. Some witnesses came forward claiming to have seen strangers near the Armand estate around the time of the murders. A man, unknown to the family, had been spotted lingering near the property, observing the household from a distance. His presence suggested an alternate theory. Perhaps Damien was not the killer, or perhaps someone else had assisted him. The mystery deepened with each account. Investigators faced another obstacle. Many witnesses had died or moved away, and memories had faded over time. The original crime scene, once pristine, had deteriorated. Key items had been lost, and physical evidence had been contaminated. Each attempt to reconstruct the events of that night only revealed more questions than answers. Yet Damien continued to thrive in his new life. Business deals, social events, and international travel filled his days. People who met him described him as charismatic and intelligent. Few suspected the shadows that clung to him, the past that he could never fully escape. In rare private moments, Damien reportedly exhibited signs of tension, pacing in silence and staring out at city lights with an expression that suggested calculation, memory, or perhaps guilt. Meanwhile, Laura Greaves, the journalist who had tracked him years earlier, remained persistent. She discovered that Damien frequently communicated with unknown associates in encrypted channels. No one knew who they were, and the secrecy only fueled speculation. Was he involved in illicit activities? Was he protecting his identity and wealth, or hiding darker truths about the night his parents died? At the same time, new forensic techniques revealed minute traces of blood in unexpected areas of the Armand estate, hinting at previously unrecognized struggles or the presence of a third party. These discoveries were tantalizing but ultimately inconclusive. The story of the murders became a puzzle with missing pieces, fragments of evidence that refused to form a complete picture. Public fascination with Damien grew. The narrative of the boy who vanished and became a billionaire captivated audiences. Documentaries, podcasts, and books examined his life from every angle. Experts debated whether Damien had been a cold-blooded murderer or a young man wrongfully suspected, destroyed by circumstance and coincidence. Each retelling added layers of intrigue, myth, and speculation. In the shadows of Greyford, the Armand mansion remained a silent witness. Doors remained locked, windows boarded, and no one dared live there again. Locals spoke of strange sounds on stormy nights, shadows moving past the broken windows, and fleeting glimpses of a figure that might have been Damien returning in secret. While these were dismissed as ghost stories, they reflected the enduring fear and fascination surrounding the case. Despite his immense wealth, Damien could not escape scrutiny entirely. Financial regulators, journalists, and private investigators occasionally came close to exposing the secrets of his fortune. Each attempt was met with swift countermeasures, legal maneuvers, private security, and strategic denials. It became clear that Damien had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight, using his intelligence and influence to remain untouchable. Yet there was an underlying tension. The combination of memory, rumor, forensic advances, and media scrutiny created a fragile situation. Every decision Damien made carried the risk of exposure. His life, built on secrecy and cunning, was a careful balance between visibility and invisibility. Any misstep could unravel everything he had built. And so, the story of Damien Armand continued, a tale of ambition, wealth, and unresolved mystery. The murders of Richard and Eleanor Armand remained a question mark over his life, a shadow that could never be fully erased. He was a man transformed, yet defined by the past he carried with him, a past that the world continued to speculate about, and a crime that might never be solved. In Greyford, generations would remember the Armand family, the night of the storm, and the boy who became a man of fortune while the echoes of tragedy remained. Damien's story was far from over, and the truth of that night continued to linger, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally uncover it. The years had passed, but the story of Damien Armand remained alive in whispers and headlines. Greyford's quiet streets still held the memory of that stormy night, the mansion standing empty as a monument to tragedy. Damien, living under a new identity, had achieved wealth and power far beyond what he had ever dreamed of in his youth. Yet the past continued to chase him, threading through his life like an invisible shadow. Damien's empire spanned continents. Skyscrapers, luxury cars, yachts, and exclusive properties marked his success. He was a man who had reinvented himself completely, leaving behind the troubled young heir of Greyford. Yet even as he walked among the world's elite, Damien remained vigilant, knowing that secrets, especially ones like his, had a way of resurfacing. Reports began to emerge of Damien's unusual behavior. Staff noticed he rarely spent nights in one location, moving frequently between cities, penthouses, and vacation homes. Security teams rotated constantly, and his conversations were always encrypted. Damien had learned to build walls not just of stone and steel, but of secrecy and control. Every aspect of his life was carefully curated to avoid exposure, yet the tension beneath his polished exterior remained. Meanwhile, Laura Greaves, the journalist who had spent years chasing him, was relentless. She had collected records, photographs, eyewitness accounts, and financial documents, all pointing to the possibility that Damien had played a role in his parents' deaths. She prepared a comprehensive dossier, ready to confront him with the accumulated evidence of decades. The risk was high, but the potential revelation was unprecedented. Back in Greyford, the town was again abuzz with speculation. New forensic reports had provided tiny but significant clues, suggesting that a third party may have been present in the Armand mansion on the night of the murders. Unidentified fingerprints and DNA traces hinted at an outsider, someone who could have entered unnoticed. The possibility that Damien had not acted alone, or perhaps not at all, fueled endless debate among investigators and locals alike. Damien's public appearances were scrutinized like never before. Each handshake, each glance, each smile was dissected by experts and commentators. While some maintained he was untouchable, others saw in him the tension of a man aware that his past could catch up at any moment. Every rumor, every report, every minor inconsistency in his story became a potential thread to unravel decades of secrecy. In his private moments, Damien's life was haunted by memory and calculation. He occasionally revisited his childhood home in Greyford in thought, replaying arguments, frustrations, and moments of anger. Did he imagine his parents' fear on that stormy night, or did he remember the reality differently? The truth, whatever it was, remained locked in his mind. Laura eventually managed to arrange a private meeting. Damien agreed to see her in a secluded location, a luxurious but isolated villa where no interruptions could occur. She presented her findings, laying out a timeline, the financial anomalies, the witness testimonies, and the forensic possibilities. Damien listened silently, occasionally nodding, never revealing the smallest hint of guilt or innocence. His composure was unnerving. After hours of questioning, Laura realized that Damien was not going to admit anything. Yet something about his demeanor told her that he was aware of the weight of the past, that he had not forgotten the events in Greyford. His silence was a statement as much as any confession could be, leaving observers to wonder if he was deflecting, concealing, or merely indifferent. While this confrontation was intense, other threads continued to emerge. Former associates, frightened of retaliation, came forward with stories of Damien's extreme measures to protect his wealth and identity. Lawsuits were filed and withdrawn, businesses changed hands suddenly, and financial audits revealed accounts with no apparent source. The scale of his resources suggested that Damien had allies and networks far beyond the public eye. Despite these revelations, the case never fully reached the courtroom. The combination of time, lack of definitive proof, and Damien's meticulous planning kept him out of legal jeopardy. Lawyers and investigators alike were frustrated. Every step closer seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. Greyford police, national authorities, and private investigators were all stymied by a wall of careful deception. Yet the story continued to fascinate. Documentaries were produced, books were written, and podcasts debated every detail of Damien's life. Experts weighed in on psychology, opportunity, and motive. Was Damien a calculating murderer or a young man unfairly judged by circumstance and rumor? The ambiguity kept audiences enthralled, eager to decide for themselves. The mansion in Greyford, meanwhile, remained silent. Its doors boarded, its windows dark, it was an enduring symbol of unresolved tragedy. Occasionally, the townspeople spoke of shadows in the windows, of fleeting glimpses of someone walking the halls. These sightings were never confirmed, but they reinforced the idea that the past never truly leaves, that the echoes of tragedy linger long after the events themselves. Damien's empire, on the other hand, flourished. He was invited to exclusive gatherings, celebrated for his business acumen, and respected in financial circles. Yet everywhere he went, the story of his past followed, a spectral companion that could not be ignored. Even as he accumulated more wealth and influence, Damien's life remained intertwined with the unsolved murders of his parents. The final twist, however, came not from forensic evidence or investigative journalism, but from the whispers of people who claimed to know more than they revealed. Former employees hinted at a hidden ledger, a private document detailing transactions, secret meetings, and possible accomplices. No one had seen the ledger, and its existence remained unverified, yet the possibility alone sent shockwaves through those still invested in the case. As the years passed, Damien continued to live, unchallenged legally but scrutinized socially and morally. The legend of the son who may have betrayed his parents for wealth grew larger with each retelling. Greyford remained haunted by the memory, and Damien's distant empire stood as both a monument to his ambition and a reminder of the unanswered questions. The final truth of that stormy night remained elusive. Was Damien guilty or innocent, a mastermind or merely a survivor of circumstance? The mystery persisted, unresolved, leaving a generation to wonder about the boy who vanished, the parents who were murdered, and the wealth that tied them all together. In the end, Damien's story is a cautionary tale. It is about ambition, greed, secrecy, and the shadows of the past that follow, no matter how far one travels. It is about a life built on careful calculation, yet haunted by a question that no amount of money or power could ever erase. And it is about a mystery that, decades later, remains unsolved, leaving the world to ask whether justice was ever truly